Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Mariela Salinas, and I'm a marketing specialist here at Educate 360. Welcome to today's webinar, Nurturing Generational Diversity, Unlocking the Strengths of Your Team, presented by our fantastic instructor, Dr. J. Pugh. Educate 360 is so excited to present this webinar today. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to you, Dr. J.
Thank you, Mariella. Appreciate it greatly. Hi, everybody. As people start making their way in, I just wanted to welcome you to Nurturing Generational Diversity. We're going to talk about how to unlock the strengths of your team. And so, a little bit about me, just FYI, before we dive in, I am our vice president for the Center for Leadership and Development. So, we have a team full of facilitators that teaches this content holistically across a 2-day course. And so, my role in this is I sort of head up our curriculum, our content, and I live and breathe in this space. I love it so much. And so I have a PhD in this space in instructional management and leadership. I've been in this leadership space for probably about 8.5 years now, and I've been in the teaching and training space for about 16, 17 years. I'm a published author. I am a hashtag girl dad. I got 4 daughters. So I could even feel the cringing behind the scenes. Yes, 4 daughters. You heard that correctly. And so now that we got more and more people making their way in, I kind of want to lead off this charge, and I kind of want to get your thoughts. I really want some honesty whenever I explain this. What do you think of when you hear the term millennial? Millennial. Type that in the chat. Young person, okay. Brilliant children, young and uncertain, just younger person, someone born, good. Born in 2000s, could be 30s, working to prove themselves, pizza. Very good. I love that. Excellent. Seem young and energetic. Now, I love where we're going with this, right? It is the future. I love that, Katrina. Futuristic. What ends up happening in the workplace? What ends up happening in the workplace? There can be some disregarding, disconnect. There can be barriers. Ooh, love that, Emily. There can absolutely be barriers. Different expectations, old versus new, history versus future. Differences of opinion and process, sometimes even a little bit of underappreciation. What also ends up happening in a little bit of any time that there is a lack of understanding when it comes to diversity is that it ends up, if there's a lack of it, it ends up coming with some stereotypes, some sort of mindsets that go into that play. And so what I'm looking for is potentially doing an hour on just ensuring how do we become change agents with this? Because if I look at any generation, if I look at Gen Z, which is even younger than millennial, how many of you knew about Gen Z? They're already entering the workforce. There we go. Gen Z is making their way. There we go. Right, Hallie? Good. Excellent. They're getting into their 20s. We're actually going to talk about that. Folks, there's something really interesting to understand when it comes to the generational workforce. And the first thing that I want us to dive into is that there it is, right? At great times having discussions. Believe it or not, for the first time, we really still have 5 generations in the workforce. 5 generations. Now, from a societal perspective or a societal study that's being done, what's being found is that you still have people that are in the silent generation that are still choosing to work. They're still working. So Social Security's been raised, the age has been raised, so people are staying longer in the workforce. And then on top of that, you're stretching that out over 5 generations. And you have people that are in the generational, that are in Gen Z, that are entering the workforce. And so the reason why I bring this up is because every single generation has a history or an understanding to it. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, typically there are two rules of thumbs. And I want to try to be very clear on this when I explain this. Number one, there is kind of this common unspoken understanding, if you will, not that it's a good one, but the previous generation always seems to think that the generation after them is a little bit worse. Like you didn't go through what I went through, right? That does have a tendency to happen sometimes. And if you look at it throughout history, you look at the silent generation, how do they view baby boomers? Anybody know? If they revert to stereotypes? Yep. Yep. They were known as the Woodstock generation. They were viewed as the Woodstock generation with boomers. And then boomers viewed the Gen X generation as the play it safers. They didn't take risks. And then Gen X took a look at Gen Z and was like, oh, this is the participation group. This is the one that they take risks on everything. What's the matter with them? They don't work. They don't work. And then millennial looks at Gen Z and goes, wow, they're extremely dependent on technology. So there's always this stereotype that we have to try to combat. We have to look past the stereotype. And very fair, to be honest with you, Carrie, every generation deserves some credit for some differing reason. Baby boomers deserve it because of their ability to dig, and push through the pain. And what I mean by push through the pain is they didn't have an option that if they were not happy in the work that they did, they still had to put up with it. They didn't have the choice to say, oh, I'll just go here. I'm not happy. So that's something they don't get credit for. And you're absolutely right. The Gen X doesn't get credit for being a huge bridge in those places. Millennials don't get enough credit for their risk-taking abilities. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the world of a millennial, they entered the workforce around whenever 9/11 was hitting. They went through 2 recessions, several viruses, and then COVID. That's been their career. No wonder they're taking risks. So if you look at every generation, there is almost this understanding that we're not looking through the other lens. And the rule of diversity as a whole, folks, is that I can't see through your lens. So I have to learn what it looks like. And that's why your ability to take off your own lenses to understand theirs is a crucial component. That's why I loved what I saw in the chat when we're saying, Tracy mentioned, parent to a Gen Z, and we're having great time during discussions. Perfect. That's what we're looking at. What I do to really try to keep it from a conceptual mindset is what is known as the breadth versus depth model. Now, has anybody ever heard of the breadth versus depth model? If not, you can give me a thumbs down. I promise you're not giving me a thumbs down because you're not liking me or anything. I know it's because you didn't hear about it. So give me a thumbs down in the reactions if you haven't heard of the breadth versus depth model. Give me a thumbs up if you have. Excellent. No worries. Perfect. Wonderful. That's what I love to see. That means we're going to learn something cool. And so here is the breadth versus depth model. I want you to imagine that you have this triangle in the workforce. And the reason why I bring this up is because the most represented generations right now in the workforce is under the age of 40, believe it or not. It is a younger generational grouping. So it's getting more and more thin as the age progresses. So what I do is this. I want you to imagine that this is somebody with 0 to 1 years of experience. 0 to 1 years is up here. And let's say 35 to 45 years of experience is down here. Here's the rule of thumb. Wherever you sit on the triangle, your goal is to be looking up and down to continuously learn from somebody else. So I'll give an example here. I've been in the workforce now for, well, not workforce. Let's say I've been in the career space for probably about 18 years now. 18 years. So I'm kind of almost at that halfway point. So anybody that has more longevity, more experience, I am consistently looking for industry depth and knowledge. I'm looking for the deeper depth. I'm looking for historical context. I'm looking for knowledge of past history, cultural understandings of the way things have been. I'm looking for industry depth, which means that if you only have two or three, we should be truly seeking industry depth from those that have been in the game for a long time, that have been in the game for a lot longer than we have. And the other rule of thumb is that, well, if I'm 35 to 45 years in, I'm going to be looking to somebody that has less experience. I'm going to be looking to see what breadth is out there from other industries, from other businesses, from other learnings. They're fresh with that information. Now, it might not be a ton of depth with it, but there's certainly a lot of breadth in what they know. So I'm going to be asking about that. So what that means, and I'm not trying to give away Mariella's age or anything like that. Mariella's a little younger than I am. So if that's the case, I'm going to be asking Mariella for what's out there. What don't I know that's out there that I'm missing? But there's other people in our organization that have been in the organization for 25 and 30 years. I'm going to ask them for industry depth, industry knowledge. That is a constant forefront of my mind that I always look for. What are the advantages of doing this? I'm going to open up the chat to you. What are the advantages for doing this, of having this sort of mentality in the way you're viewing these models? What's the advantages? Oh, love the first answer I just saw come right through there, Tracy. Greater access to more information. Absolutely. It is always accessible. Haley, constantly learning. Couldn't agree more. Hallie, diversity of perspectives, lived experiences hit. It is right, and it is. It's accelerating it, Ann. You're right. It's expanding in all directions. There's diversity, wider audience and participation, Rebecca. Realistic creativity. It is, Valerie. Learning to work with everybody. What you start to do, Jennifer, this is a huge point here, and Emily mentions this too. Your paradigm starts to shift from somebody of, well, you haven't been here long enough to, you know what? You know things I don't, and vice versa. Rather than somebody younger saying, well, I'm trying to have a voice here and I'm trying to make myself out here and earn a position. Then all of a sudden what happens is let me learn from somebody who's been there. So it really changes the paradigm, as Emily's saying. There's a lot more sharing of information. I love that sheet. Yes, absolutely, is transfer of knowledge. There is a much more synergetic transfer of knowledge. There is new insight, Yahira. Absolutely. And so because of this, the reason why I bring this up is because every generation has benefits in what they offer as a whole. So in this case, you look at traditionalists, I will tell you right now, there is no generation more proud and more loyal than the silent generation. The reason why that was they were they were with world wars. That's what they were born into. They understood that the things really, really didn't come easy. Everything was a scrape. So loyalty was literally everything. You look at it from a business perspective too. And what that meant is before there used to be a lot more pensions, right? So pensions were an act of loyalty because it kept people to stay because they could earn and invest into themselves. But they were very cautious. They were very cautious. They didn't speak up. There wasn't about voicing a lot of things. Then you had the baby boomers, and the baby boomers were extremely competitive. They were driven, they were competitive. They were ones that were very much about, I'm going to take this chance, I'm going to do this. And that's why, and you're right, G, you're right. It absolutely has changed over time. The generational construct, not just from a lived experience, but from a work experience, has changed because of the constructs. Baby boomers, and I'll bring this in. My dad is at the beginning end of the baby boomer era. And he is somebody that was very much about, it wasn't about having an education. It was about truly pushing yourself, driving, and working as hard as you can. It was really about what they viewed more important than anything else was your ability to work hard. It was about working harder. The harder you worked, the more respect you got. Once again, there's advantages and disadvantages with all of these. The disadvantage with that is sometimes working smarter wasn't always the best option because there weren't as resources and there weren't options to go. Now, from a work environment, how many of you notice that when you talk about baby boomers and even Generation Jones, that what starts to happen is they stay with their company for 20, 25 years? How many of you notice that? The reason why, embrace yourself for this, and some of you are going to laugh, and I don't like to ask anybody their age, but if you are in the baby boomer Generation Jones, what ended up happening is if they were not happy with their position, anybody know where they had to go? Anybody know where they had to go? If right, number one is personnel. And then if they really were ready to try to leave their company, where did they go? Where did they go? Anybody remember the classified section in the newspaper? Yeah, they had those things, newspapers. And they would go back to the classified sections, the one ads. They would circle jobs. They would go and physically take their resumes. And most importantly, jobs were localized. They were not global. They were not global. They were local. So if they were not happy, they didn't have a lot of options to go elsewhere. My dad makes kind of a cynical joke at times, right? And they were. Applications were in person. Resumes were handed in person. What ends up happening here, right, and this is where we remember the job wanted ads. We remember some of these things. My dad always makes the joke that he's worked for his organization for 43 years and he was miserable for him for about 30. He makes that as a joke. Now, I think he was happier during a little bit more than that, but he makes that joke. But the thing is that he was loyal because that's how he drove himself to get to where he needed to be. And he couldn't go elsewhere unless he relocated or he had to wait for the classifieds. So that changes perspectives. Now we start shifting into Generation Jones and really start hitting into Generation X. Generation Jones was a very careful, resourceful group. Yes. And you're right. And Celia, you're absolutely right, is that Generation Jones, more than any other group, is very cynical. They are very cynical. And I would say they are the most realistic out of anybody. They are the most, I'm not going to say pessimistic because that's not what it is. They are truly realists. They like being the devil's advocate to things because of what they watched. They're very cynical. And cynical is not a bad thing. They are very protective. They were meant to be chameleons. That's their greatest advantage, is that they were very adaptable within their jobs. So then they didn't see reasons why people needed to leave. Then you start, right, Once again, advantages to all of these folks. That's what I want us to learn out of this is every single one of these. Yes, Ari, yes, very, very true. Yes, the generation is it, and the baby boomer numbers is within that. Yeah. So that sub generation, most of the 45 to 50 million is out of that 76 million. Yes. What ends up happening after that is you start to hit Gen X. Now, Gen X is the smallest grouping of a full generation since traditionalists. What that means is that they really do serve as a bridge. They're independent thinkers. This was the generation that was outside for a lifetime. You know, they really you didn't know where they were. They were really pioneers. They were explorers. But it's almost like once they found what they liked, what they learned is that your goal is to work your tail off and climb up the ladder. That is what your goal is. And that's when you've achieved success. And they push loyalty because that's what their parents, who were traditionalists, push. They were known as a play it safer generation. They worked hard. And that's exactly right, Tracy. Gen X has watched traditional parents lose them, right? Lose jobs. And so because of that, it's that loyalty really shifted. And then it was working up, and working up. Absolutely. How many of you are starting to really go through this and go, yeah, that makes a lot of sense? I'm really learning about these other generations and what values they bring. The reason why I bring this up is because sometimes what happens is we view, and I'm not saying in the era of the okay boomer, right, on the TikTok generations and things like that, right? We have okay boomers or these young generations, they don't know this or they don't. That is not going to help any perspective because we're only looking at it from our lens. And what I'm hoping we achieve in this is we learn what it looks like from the other lens. Ari, this is from Lindsay Pollock's The Remix. So she went through and had all of this research that came into play. So that's where her research was done there. The Zennial subgeneration. This once again falls between Gen X and millennial. Now, this subgeneration has a little bit of a different understanding of things. Anybody know why with the Zennials? Why it's a little bit different for them? This generation moved. I would say education is one. I would tie that to the millennial a hair more, but you're right. You're right, Ari. Yep. Barriers of perspectives of thinking. Here's where Zennials come in that they provide an advantage. Every time, well, a pandemic comes into play. Absolutely, Jonathan. Every time that new technology was introduced, Zennials were always in that evolution with it. They were always in that evolution. So they're almost one of the last generations to not have technology growing up. But then they're right. They were before, right? But even before pagers, right? Both parents were working, right? This was right around when video game era started coming in. This was whenever technology was starting to evolve, they evolved with it. They, as kids, were the last generation that didn't have computers, didn't have technology, but then they started to have technology in the classroom. And then they started to, in college. In college, they were the first ones to have email before entering the workforce. They were the first ones to type papers up. They grew with Word. They grew with PowerPoint. They grew with Excel. They learned to balance that evolution of technology with still the old world, the old school perspectives. So that's where I always say that the later Gen X and the Zennials, this grouping is really a bridge grouping. They're a very bridge grouping because they see the history of old and they see the new that comes into play. Yeah, they went through typewriters, PCs, and now laptops, and now smart and right, and now iPads and everything, and smartphones. So they became extremely resourceful. They were very moldable, very adaptable, very resourceful. The other thing that came into play is that with that came the generation of millennials. Now, millennials, once again, very self expressive, once again, because they were taught they could be, that participation. Quite possibly, Ari. Quite possibly. Yep. That, like I said, this is according to Lindsay Pollock's numbers. Could it be a variation of a year or two? I've seen millennials at 1982. I've even seen them at 1983. So, yes, I would say that if it was Zennials, it could be 75 even, right? Because they were typically in college whenever phones were really starting to come out, really even a little after college. Yep. So millennials, the reason why that they matter in what they've done is because they've only known risk. Does anybody know how many CEOs there are out there, especially in tech, that are under the age of 45? There's a ton. It can. Yes, Lisa. Yes. It means that you might associate with a sub generation. Maybe it's something that you're like, you know what, I really don't identify with baby boomers, but in this case, it's a sub generation, right? It's more of I kind of move a little bit closer to here. They are because once again, they walked into every horrible situation you can imagine. Since the traditionalists, they've walked into every bad situation, multiple wars, 9/11, two recessions, full blown pandemic, and that's been their career. So they're resilient and they take risks because they can. They grew up knowing that they had the participation. And yeah, well, and that student loan debt starts to come in from baby boomers saying, I want you to have a better life than what I had. I want you to have a better life than I had. So I want you to go to college so that life becomes easier. And then college flooded. And now you're looking to where Generation Z, or known as the I generation, they became much more tech advanced. They really know technology better than anybody. And they've become very vocal because they've only known having a platform for it. Social media was already establishing, right? You look at Facebook, it established in 2003. MySpace was 2001. You start to go up through Instagram and you go through TikTok and all of this. All iGen is known is a social media platform. They've only known digital. Now, the reason why I bring this up is when you have somebody that's more Gen Z, that's known tech dependency, that provides advantages and some disadvantages, and you look at something where it's baby boomer or Generation Jones that is in this place of saying, you know what? It was more industry, more supply chain management, more manufacturing. You're going to have two different lived perspectives. And your goal is to learn from the other. And that's why you look at baby boomer, Generation Jones, Generation X, they're very much pick up the phone. There's a majority that lives in that pick up the phone. And you look at generation, the millennial and Gen Z, and they look at it as shoot me a text. If I need to call you, I will. But I don't need to do that. You're right. That's a perfect example. What barriers, right? That call could have been an email. And gee, that's so important as society ecosystems have changed. Our societal ecosystems and our workplace ecosystems have changed over time. That meeting could have been an email. That email needed to be a meeting because we went through 14, right? Or it's the other way around. We had 14 emails that somebody should have just picked up the phone. So I bring this up, and this is very good question here, Dana. How do you balance customer service preferences? This is something I taught in a previous webinar. This is something I've taught in a previous webinar, and I would go check it out if you get a chance today. Is I taught about understanding people's values, interests, and preferences, VIPs. The more that you get to know what people value, what their interests are, and what their preferences are in communication, the more likely we're going to meet people where they are. Really good question there. So the reason why I bring this up is because millennials are really starting to take over the workforce. Right now, the silent generation is less than 5% of the workforce. And baby boomers in the next 5 years, right? Baby boomers in the next 5 years are going to be getting closer to retirement, which means that by right now, where it sits, as of 2015, millennials were about 25% of the workforce. Just within the last 5 years after that, 33% of the workforce is millennial, 1 out of 3. And what is going to happen over the next 6 years that we're going to start to see is nearly 70 to 75% of workers in the workforce by 2030 will be millennial or Gen Z. There will be a small percentage of baby boomer. I would probably say the other 15 to 20% still rolling is going to be Gen X. And then there's going to be a group of generations coming in, getting closer to the workforce, which gets to not just Gen Z, but now Gen A. And that's not a Forrest Gump reference, folks, if you got that one. Gen A. It's actually going to be Gen A, which is the next generation. And so now I love what this comes into is when we get into things of how does this shape our technology? How does this shape society? I'm seeing things like AI. I'm seeing things coming into the workforce like job turnover with younger generations. So that leads me to a question of, in this world of organizations now, to where the younger generation they only know zigzagging. Because if they zigzag, they'll make more money elsewhere, they'll get their experience, and then they'll zigzag somewhere else. And they'll do that until they find where they think their peak is, and then they'll stay there. They can. The reason they do it is because they can. Once again, Gen X, baby boomer, didn't have that luxury because everything was localized. Now that everything's globalized, and with a pandemic coming in and saying, yeah, you can work wherever you want. My headquarters is out of Boston. I don't live in Boston. So now, because of this, it's made businesses have to be much more competitive. It's a buyer's market, and your buyers are your people. So that leads me to this question. How do we make sure that people stay engaged? What does engagement look like to each generation? How do we make sure everybody's engaged? Oh, Carrie, love that. Yes, we have to be intentional. VIPs, Hallie, yeah, we have to get to know their VIPs. Getting comfortable with the technology in that usage. Yes. Inclusive work environment, Haley, huge. Engaging the interest, Rebecca. Be curious, collaborate, Love these answers. Be curious. Managing communications. Similar to social, there has to be ways to achieve engagement. Everybody has something to give, Tracy. You're absolutely right. And I really like this, Haley, is involve all levels of staff in the dialogue. If companies, if they think that decisions are solely being made at the top and being pushed down, people feel like they're not valued, they're not heard and understood, so they leave. And diversity is the new advantage. You're absolutely right, Chief. And Ari, you mentioned we know it's expensive to retire, and many baby boomers, for example, like to remain working. How will they manage this with the number of young people out there in the world? It's a fantastic question. Here's the challenge here's how I'd rephrase this question, Ari, because I think this is huge. It is expensive to retire. They'd like to remain working. With managing and having younger people in there, that's where that breadth model really comes into play. Because the leaders, and I will tell you that there's people that do it very well. There's baby boomers that do it very well, that they are constantly open for suggestions. They're constantly open for feedback. They really try to do this in a way to where they look at somebody else and say, you know what? I could learn something from you. And the ones that do that, the younger generation grips to them quicker. So it is important for them to make sure that they're adapting. And I liked it, Kimberly, right? There's happy hours, there's online games, there's connectivity. The goal here is connectivity. If you ask a younger generational workforce what matters most to them, does anybody know the number one reason why people leave a job? It is not money. It is not benefits. Bingo, Ann. That's number 3, Emily. Number one is their relationship with their immediate supervisor. Number 2, for the younger generation, it is their ability to maintain and achieve a work-life balance. They don't live to work. They work to live. And number 3 is that they do not feel heard or understood or supported, which means that they don't feel like they belong. How that is very different from 30 years ago in the workforce, which means leading with, say, for instance, the carrot and the stick doesn't work anymore. The carrot and stick doesn't incentivize. How you get people to stay, people stay for their bosses. They stay for relationships. They stay if they belong, if they feel like they belong to an identity. No, right. And everything now is on LinkedIn, Indeed, Monster, Career Builder. Everything is out there. So we have to readapt. And we have to understand that that diversity is the new advantage. Things like cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, social skills are much more important today than they ever have been. So whenever we talk about this and thinking about this a little bit more, we run into things like employee engagement, right? Well, people that stay are people that feel trusted, they feel valued, they feel empowered, they feel challenged, they feel like what they do, and I mean when I say fulfilled by their work, they believe that the work they do creates impact for another being. They are more interpersonal. Whereas a more established generation, many of them stay in it for the competence and the integrity. The younger generation stays in it for the impact and intentions of helping others. Employees still feel like they are doing something meaningful. Yes, I would say so, Ari. They have more of an instant gratification than typically generations of past. So yes. So but their gratification comes in the form of doing something that means something to somebody else. It is. I would agree with that, Chi. Absolutely. Now, the challenges to employee engagement that comes into play is that they leaders and companies still try to view this that the work has to come first. Now, how many of you in your mind have that mentality in the back of your mind? The work is most important. Work is most important. Many people, may I ask? And they are competing values, Carrie. Yep. And I like Seal It, right? Seal It's like, no. And this is where this comes into play. So what happens here is if you look at different generational understandings, this is where disconnect can occur. This is where disconnect can occur. Because sometimes with corporations, what they'll look at their people as cogs in the wheel, that they are contributing, and that's their job, is to contribute. But now, because it's a buyer's market, we have to look at our people like assets. Our number one asset and our number one expense in business are our people, not our buildings, not our space, not our equipment. It's our people. Human capital. If you lose, every time you lose an employee, and Ari mentioned this first, is that every time you lose an employee, whether it's to retirement or whether it's to them leaving, it costs about 50 to 60% of their salary to replace them, because now management is now involved in having to rehire, rehiring or training, onboarding, getting them up to speed to where the previous position was, is typically about 6 months of loss per person. And yeah, you lose all that knowledge transfer. And that's where, if you have to look at this from a corporate standpoint, you need if I could give advice to any larger organization, your ability to invest in your people as human beings, as growth minded beings, and as beings that value work-life balance, they will dig deeper for you. They will go to the end of the earth for you more naturally. And once again, you cannot, if you use any of this for manipulation, you will bury your reputation, folks. Your goal is to use this to create better connections. A benefit coming out of that will be that you will get people that are dedicated to their work, that are more wanting to do that because they want to do it for you. They want to do it for a company they believe in. They do it because they think the company cares for them. It's huge, Emily. It's a huge piece that we have to make sure we're keeping in mind. Because if you ask, especially millennial generation, they're now the largest generation in the workforce. Diversity is not only expected, it is important to them. If they look at an organization and don't see diversity, they think something's wrong with the organization. They're the most college educated, which does not make them the best. I'm going to say this, just because they're college educated doesn't make them the best. They're most college educated because they were pushed into that college education. They are protected. They were taught. That's also why they take risks, because they had safety nets. They like acceptance. And the other thing is this is the generation, you listen to marriage statistics and those numbers keep increasing and increasing of divorce rates. 1 out of 4 millennials are single parent families. So they look for acceptance. They look for belonging. They look for what is called And Maslow highlights this very well: psychological safety. Millennials and see what now, this is a huge piece here, because in the previous generation, the American dream was having independence. Previous generations, it was about having independence and autonomy. The American dream for younger generations is to have social belonging. It's that they belong, that they're a part of something, that they're accepted. That is the younger person's American dream. That's why they're on social media. That's why they're attached, because they have the platform to be noticed, to be accepted, and to belong. Absolutely, Carrie, that it does have to be dependent on values and the greatest. That's why VIPs, going back to those VIPs, are really important. So one of the last things I think we can do that I think will create impact in this goes to David Little. David Little wrote a book called Managing Conflict. And one thing that I try to do when I work with generations that are younger is I draw on positive psychology and emotional intelligence. I really do this, and I ask what are called inquiry-based questions, not inquiry with an I. Anybody know the difference between inquiry with an I and inquiry with, or sorry, inquiry with an E and inquiry with an I? Other than one starts with an I and one starts with an E? I like this. Excellent. Ready for that? And here's the thing. Very good. Ready? Yes, we're getting somewhere, Ari. Yes. Inquiry with an I is meant to seek answers. You ask questions to seek answers. Meaning, why did you do it this way? Why was this done the way it was done? I hate to say the questions that come in is, what were you doing? What are you doing? And many experienced generations, that's how they worked in the workforce is, what are you working on? What are you doing? What do you need help with? It's a lot of inquiry answer-based questions. Younger generations, the engagement questions we ask are more inquiry-driven questions, which the goal is to discover their perspective first. It's to discover their perspective. So I ask a lot, and I'm going to give some examples of engagement questions, but I'm also going to give you some examples of inquiry-driven phrases I use. Some people, one of the most famous ones that come into play is help me understand it. Help me understand. I don't pull that one off very well. It's not in my MO. I'm not as good with that one. But other phrases that are really good is explain it to me. Explain it to me. Walk me through it. Walk me through it. My favorite, Emily, is similar to that. Talk to me about that. Talk to me. I love using talk to me. That's my go-to. Give me more details so I can see it. Ready for this one? This is another one I love to use. Show me what that looks like. Show me what that looks like. Your goal, as Ari said, is to open them up. Your goal is to open them up so that they can elaborate, feel heard, feel understood, and that way they can communicate, and then you can give the meaningful back and forth dialogue on it. That's a huge piece of this. And it's visualizing, it's allowing them to elaborate, but it's giving them the air to move. Yeah. Paint a picture for me, Carrie. Yeah. Here's some other questions that you can ask that I think would be really meaningful. Can you describe a time when the relationship or who you worked for was clicking well? What elements of your work relationships do you feel proud of or that you enjoy? What strengths do other people on your team have that you value or you respect? Do you see how these are elaborative questions? They're really meant to open up and discover their perspective. If it's a conflict driven situation, if that other person was here right now, what would they say? What would you like to say to them and what would they say? How do you think that other person is living? How do we get back to neutrality? How do we get back to where we need to get to? What changes would you make to make things better? These are all questions that if you're stuck in the mud or you feel like you're not getting anywhere, these are great opening or questions that open up other people to get them to communicate back to you. With that said, I want to make sure I leave some room for questions. Absolutely, Chia. It allows you to understand conflict and walk into it with transparency. Absolutely. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions that you may have. And as you may be typing them out, I just want to let you know our Center for Leadership and Development, we've been doing this. We have so many resources that you have out there. We do face-to-face, we do virtual. We've been doing virtual live trainings and facilitation since 2001. So even if you've been in the pandemic, we have been in this space for over 20 years now. So feel free that if you need anything, please reach out to your account manager, educational consultant, anybody that they will get a hold of you and be able to work with you. And so, Carrie, what is the biggest challenge that I see for the next decade in regards to generation? Really good question. Number one, I think what's going to start to happen with the next generation as far as Gen A. As Gen A enters the workforce, I think there's going to be higher levels of anxiety that's going to exist. There's going to be there's going to be a greater want or need to want to make people happy. So they are going to they're really going to ask a lot of validation questions. They're going to ask validation questions. Self-esteem is going to be a huge challenge because once again, they are only knowing social media platforms. That's going to be a challenge. So your goal to validate is going to seem tedious, but it's going to be meaningful with the next generation. And what do I see the biggest challenges between millennials and Gen X? The movement. The answer to that question is movement. And what I mean by movement is Gen X are more careful, calculated, they're more reserved in making decisions, and millennials are risk takers. They're go, go, go. They want to take action. So the movement is the biggest challenge between those two. Suggestions for who use the excuse, this is just who I am. Love this, Hallie. I recommend they take expanding your emotional intelligence, because emotional intelligence is your balance between self-awareness and self-regulation, which means there's a big difference between saying, I know who I am, and this is just who I am. I know who I am means I know who I am and I'm willing to make adjustments and adaptations. That's self-regulation. This is just who I am is self-awareness without self-regulation. This is just who I am. This is just who I am means I'm incapable of change. And we're not incapable of change. Excellent. Okay, two more questions, and then we're going to go ahead and pack it in just for sake of time. How would it be best to normalize the culture within departments and companies? Ooh, but Ari, I would go right back, and I will tell you, I am the young, even though I'm our VP, I am the youngest person on our team of facilitators. I'm the youngest. So if that's the case, I really use the breadth versus depth model. I do. I share a lot of my knowledge with what's out there in research and what is out there. And I look for industry knowledge from the people who've been doing it for longer than I am. And so if it's an older person working with a younger person, they need to respect the idea that there might be information out there that they don't know. That breadth versus depth model is really, really key. All right, Eric, how much of these are due to age? Yeah, I think, Eric, this is a great question. Is could it be due to age? I think that there's factors that go into age than generational gaps. I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think that there are social norms that come into play though. And I think it's because many people experience either a traumatic environments or very game changing environments that shape the way that they do what they do. Um, and you're right that people become more risk averse when they get older. That is true. I think that age and generation sometimes go hand in hand. I think they go a little bit more hand in hand. And Haley, how does age impact DEI, B views, and biases, and how those impact workplace? I think they do. I think there's a factor in it because once again, you look at historical context to go into play. You know, views on race, views on women, views on ethnicity has shifted. It's shifted, and the other reason why I wouldn't say it's just age, I would say it's globalization, Haley. I would say globalization is going to change that too, because once again, we've gone from a very localized area to where people are like us, look like us, be like us, to a much more global pool of employees and workers. So that is going to impact the way that we view this. And Chi, how does AI's how will AI's place in a society and workplace ecosystems? I could give you a whole, we're going to be building a whole curriculum around that, Chi. To give a very, very short answer, the goal behind AI is that it's supposed to replace the mundane, the iteratives. It's meant to just replace the cyclical things that need done to free up time for people to have more creativity. That is the game plan. That is typically what the ethics in AI are being used for. And Valerie, that's exactly why we said what we did at the beginning of this webinar. Is the game plan is not to look at these with a stereotypical view, but to look at this from a lens of saying, hey, this is what's important to people, and this is what's important because this is their lived experience. Chi, I think from an administrative side, there might be some elimination of jobs. I think from a understanding of data entry things that there could be some shifting in jobs. But once again, where there is shift, there's new opportunities for new positions. Just like how we've moved from a manufacturing industry to much more of a technological industry, people have made those shifts as well. So I think where one door closes, another door opens. Well, folks, I want to make sure Mariella has a moment to talk to you all. I really want to thank you for a wonderful hour, for a wonderful session. Thank you for enjoying this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Mariella.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. J. This was a lot of fantastic info, and I think our audience would 100% agree. And audience, if you guys need any more information on this topic, please do not be afraid to visit us at newhorizons.com. If you missed out on any part of this session, we will be sharing a recording with you all in an email after the webinar, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks again, Dr. J.
Thank you, everybody. You take care and have a great rest of your week.
Absolutely. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you all so much for joining us today, everyone. Goodbye, and have a great one.